When 12 children between the ages of 6 and 14 were locked in absolute darkness beneath a Kentucky plantation in 1856, their captor believed he was hiding valuable property from creditors, but what he actually created was a crucible that would forge 12 of the most resilient souls in American history. Before we descend into this remarkable story of survival and the unbreakable human spirit, make sure to hit that bell icon and subscribe to this channel to follow more powerful stories like this one. Stories that honor the strength of our ancestors and remind us that even in humanity's darkest moments, hope finds a way to survive. The spring of 1856 brought unusual rains to Lexington, Kentucky, turning the roads to mud and the fields of Blackwell Plantation into waterlogged expanses that delayed planting by nearly 3 weeks. But the weather was not the greatest concern of plantation owner Richard Blackwell. He was drowning in debt, having gambled away a fortune in Louisville, and his creditors were circling like vultures, threatening to seize his assets, including the 47 people he held enslaved. Among those 47 were 12 children whom Blackwell had purchased at various auctions over the previous 2 years, intending to train them in specific skills that would increase their value. Now, facing the imminent seizure of his property, Blackwell made a decision that would haunt the conscience of anyone who later learned of it. He would hide the 12 children in the plantation's old root cellar until the debt crisis passed, keeping them as secret assets that creditors couldn't claim. On April 3, 1856, the 12 children were led down crude stone steps into a cellar that had been dug decades earlier, a space roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling so low that even the tallest child, 14-year-old Samuel, had to stoop when standing. The door was closed, locked, and concealed. The darkness that descended was absolute. The 12 children were Samuel, age 14, Ruth, age 13, Moses, age 12, Clara, age 11, Benjamin, age 10, Sarah, age 10, Isaiah, age 9, Rebecca, age 8, Elijah, age 7, Grace, age 7, Job, age 6, and Mary, age 6. They came from different plantations, different states, different family backgrounds, but they were about to become something more profound than siblings. They would become a unit of survival, a community forged in darkness, a family created not by blood, but by shared ordeal and mutual dependence. In the first hours after the door closed, the younger children cried, their sobs echoing off the stone walls in the pitch blackness. The older children tried to comfort them, their voices strained with their own fear, but attempting to project calm. Samuel, who had been enslaved on 3 different plantations and had learned early how to read situations and adapt to survive, was the first to speak with clear authority. "Listen to me, all of you," he said into the darkness, his voice steady despite the terror he felt. "We crying ain't going to change nothing. We got to think. We got to stay calm. We got to take care of each other." Ruth, who had been separated from her mother just 6 months earlier and still carried that grief like a stone in her chest, added her voice. "Samuel right. We got now. We got to be family to each other." What none of the children could know in those first terrifying hours was that Richard Blackwell's temporary solution would stretch from days into weeks, from weeks into months, and from months into years, as his financial and legal troubles deepened and his own conscience became so corrupted by greed and fear that he simply left them there, occasionally sending food and water, but otherwise abandoning 12 human children to darkness. The cellar had originally been designed to store root vegetables through the winter, which meant it had some ventilation through small gaps near the ceiling where air could circulate, though no light penetrated. There was a crude drainage channel that prevented complete flooding during rains, though dampness was constant. The space was cool, hovering around 55 degrees year-round, cold enough to be uncomfortable, but not immediately dangerous. Blackwell had left them some rough blankets, a bucket for waste, and promised that food would come regularly. That first night, Though they had no way to distinguish night from day anymore, the 12 children huddled together for warmth and comfort, their young minds trying to process the incomprehensible reality of their situation. Moses, who had been learning to read in secret from his previous owner's children, began to speak in the darkness, telling stories he remembered from the Bible, stories his mother had told him about their African ancestors, anything to fill the silence and give the younger children something to focus on besides their fear. "We're going to die down here," he thought. "But I can't let them know I'm thinking that." The first week was the hardest, as the children adjusted to the absolute absence of light and the loss of any natural rhythm of day and night. Their bodies, accustomed to the sun's cycle, rebelled against the constant darkness. Some children couldn't sleep, their minds refusing to accept rest in the perpetual night. Others slept too much, retreating into unconsciousness as an escape from reality. But Samuel and Ruth, the two oldest, understood instinctively that survival required structure, routine, and purpose. They began to organize the group, creating an invisible order in the darkness. "We need to know where everything is," Samuel announced on what they decided to call the third day, though they had no way to accurately track time. "We touch the walls, count our steps, make a map in our minds. This space is going to be our home for however long, so we need to know it, like we know our own hands." They spent hours teaching the younger children to navigate by touch and sound, creating a mental geography of their prison. The northwest corner became the sleeping corner, where they piled the blankets and huddled together for warmth. The northeast corner held the waste bucket, which they emptied through a drainage grate. The south wall, where the door was located, became the food wall, where they would wait for the irregular deliveries that came through a small opening. 2 weeks in, small Blackwell's enslaved man, Job, began to lose his grip on reality, crying constantly for his mother and refusing to eat the meager portions of cornbread and beans that were pushed through the food slot. Grace, only 7 herself, but possessed of a gentle spirit that belied her age, took Job under her special care. She would hold him in the darkness, singing softly the songs her own mother had sung, creating a nest of comfort with her body and voice. "Your mama loves you, Job," Grace would whisper. "She's thinking about you right now, wherever she is. She's sending that love through the darkness, and it's finding you. Can you feel it?" Job would nod, even though he couldn't feel anything but the cold stone and the oppressive dark, because he needed to believe what Grace was telling him. The other children watched this act of compassion and learned from it that even in the worst circumstances, kindness was not a luxury but a necessity, not a weakness but a strength. Clara, age 11, emerged as another leader, but in a different way. She began to organize games that could be played in complete darkness, games that exercised their minds and bodies and gave them something to do besides sit and despair. They played guessing games where one child would make a sound and others would identify what it was mimicking. They played counting games, seeing who could count the highest without making a mistake. They even created a form of tag, though in the confined space and total darkness, it was more about listening and sensing movement than seeing. These games were more than entertainment. They were cognitive training that kept their minds sharp when sensory deprivation threatened to dull their faculties. 1 month into their captivity, the food deliveries became less regular, sometimes arriving twice in what seemed like a day, sometimes not coming for what felt like endless stretches that left them weak and dizzy with hunger. The person who brought the food never spoke, never responded to their calls and questions, simply shoved food through the slot and disappeared. This irregularity made time even more difficult to track. Moses, who had appointed himself the keeper of time, tried to measure days by sleep cycles, but in the constant darkness, sleep became irregular and unreliable. "I think we've been here maybe 30 days, he would announce. "Maybe 40. I ain't sure no more." The loss of time measurement was psychologically devastating. Humans orient themselves through temporal markers: morning, noon, night, days of the week, seasons. The children had none of that. Their world had collapsed into an eternal now, a single extended moment of darkness that seemed to have no beginning and promised no end. Ruth understood that this loss of time could destroy their hope, so she created a ritual. "Every time we all sleep and wake up together, we calling that a new day," she declared. "And every 7 days, we having a Sunday. On Sunday, we tell stories about freedom, about what we going to do when we get out of here." This simple structure gave them something to count toward, a way to mark progress, even though they had no idea if their measurements bore any relationship to actual time passing in the world above them. 3 months in, Rebecca, age 8, discovered that she could see colors in the darkness. Not actual colors, but phantom images her brain created to compensate for the lack of visual input. "I see blue," she would announce in wonder, "like the sky, but moving like water." The other children initially thought she was losing her mind, but then more of them began to experience similar phenomena. Flashes of light, geometric patterns, swirling colors, all hallucinations created by light-starved brains desperately trying to make sense of the void. Rather than being frightened by these visions, Ruth encouraged the children to share them, turning the hallucinations into a form of shared storytelling. "Tell us what you seeing, Rebecca," Ruth would say. "Make it a story." And Rebecca would describe her visions in elaborate detail. Cities made of light, rivers flowing with stars, gardens where flowers bloomed in colors that didn't exist in the real world. The other children would add their own visions, creating a collective dreamscape that existed only in their darkness, but which became more real to them than the cold stone surrounding them. This act of shared imagination was more than escapism. It was a sophisticated survival strategy that kept their minds active and their hopes alive, proving that these children, even the youngest, possessed remarkable psychological resilience. 6 months into their imprisonment, Elijah, age 7, stopped speaking entirely. He would eat when fed, would follow instructions, would participate in activities, but he emitted no words, as if language itself had become meaningless in a world without light. The other children were frightened by his silence, seeing in it a preview of what might happen to all of them if they stayed in the darkness too long. Sarah, age 10, who had been quiet herself up until this point, took it upon herself to bring Elijah back to speech. She would sit with him for hours, talking to him about everything and nothing, memories of her mother, stories she invented, descriptions of imaginary feasts, dreams of freedom. She never demanded that he respond, never pressured him, just filled the silence around him with her voice like water wearing away stone. "You don't got to talk, Elijah," she would say softly. "But I'm going to keep talking to you so you remember what words sound like, so you remember you got a voice." 3 weeks of this steady companionship passed before Elijah finally whispered a single word: hungry. It was perhaps the most beautiful word Sarah had ever heard, because it meant Elijah was still in there, still human, still capable of expressing need and desire. The other children celebrated with a vigor disproportionate to the event because they understood its significance. Elijah's return to speech meant that the darkness hadn't won yet, that they were still human beings with inner lives and the capacity for connection. As the months stretched on, the children developed a sophisticated understanding of each other's emotional states based entirely on non-visual cues. They could hear in the quality of someone's breathing whether they were truly asleep or merely pretending. They could detect in the subtle shifts of movement whether someone was on the verge of breakdown or managing to hold themselves together. They could sense in the tone of voice emotions that others were trying to hide. This forced empathy, this necessary attunement to each other's inner states, created bonds between them that were deeper than any they had known before. Benjamin, age 10, who had a beautiful singing voice, became their emotional barometer and their healer. When he sensed that despair was settling over the group, he would begin to sing. Spirituals his grandmother had taught him, work songs he had learned in the fields, sometimes songs he invented on the spot. His voice in the darkness became their beacon, a reminder that beauty could exist even in the absence of light. The other children would join him, their voices blending in harmonies they couldn't see but could feel vibrating in their chests, creating something transcendent from their shared misery. Music became their church, their therapy, their defiance. When they sang, they were not victims but survivors, not property but human beings with souls that no amount of darkness could extinguish. 1 year into their captivity, though their timekeeping had become increasingly uncertain, Isaiah, age 9, began to teach the others what he knew about herbs and healing from watching his mother, who had been a root worker. He couldn't see the herbs, of course, couldn't apply any treatments, but he could pass on the knowledge, ensuring it wouldn't die with him in the darkness. He taught them which plants could reduce fever, which could settle an upset stomach, which could help wounds heal cleanly. The knowledge was theoretical in their current situation, but the teaching and learning gave them purpose and prepared them for survival in whatever future they might have. Clara built on this by teaching mental mathematics, showing the children how to calculate in their heads, how to solve problems, how to think logically and systematically. Moses continued his storytelling, but now he challenged the other children to remember the stories and retell them, training their memories. Ruth taught them to meditate, to control their breathing, to find inner calm even when outer circumstances were chaotic. What emerged was an underground school, an academy in darkness where knowledge flowed between students and teachers who were all between the ages of 6 and 14. Proving that education and intellectual growth could occur even in the most suppressed circumstances. These children were not being educated by adults. They were educating each other, creating a curriculum of survival that addressed body, mind, and spirit. 18 months in, the food slot suddenly stopped opening for what felt like many days, maybe a week or more, and true starvation began to threaten them. The children had been perpetually hungry during their entire captivity, but this was different. This was the body beginning to consume itself. Was weakness so profound that movement became difficult? Was the cold becoming unbearable as their bodies had no fuel to generate warmth? They huddled together in the sleeping corner, conserving energy, their conversations becoming whispered and sporadic. Mary, the youngest girl at 6 years old when they entered the cellar but now 7, began to talk about the feast she would eat when she got out. "I'm going to have cornbread with butter melting on top," she whispered, her voice weak, "and greens with fatback, and sweet potato pie, and milk, cold milk in a cup." The other children joined in, each describing their imaginary feast in elaborate detail, and the collective fantasy became a form of nourishment in itself, feeding their spirits, if not their bodies. "We're going to die this time," Samuel thought, though he didn't say it. "This is finally it." But then the food slot opened, and hands pushed through more food than they had received in months. Bread, dried meat, apples, even a jar of molasses. They ate slowly, carefully, knowing that gorging after starvation could be dangerous, rationing the unexpected bounty. They never learned why the food had stopped or why it resumed, just as they never knew why anything happened to them anymore. They existed at the whim of forces they couldn't see or understand, which was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their captivity. 2 years in, the children began to change in ways that went beyond the physical deterioration from malnutrition and lack of sunlight. Their voices sounded different, older, worn down by the constant dampness that made them cough and wheeze. The younger ones had grown taller in the darkness, their bodies developing in ways they couldn't see. Ruth, who had been 13 when they entered, was now 15 and had experienced her first menstruation in the darkness. A frightening and confusing event that the older girls helped her through with what limited knowledge they had. Samuel's voice had deepened and cracked, marking his transition toward manhood in a space where he couldn't see his own changing reflection. They were literally growing up in the dark, missing crucial developmental experiences, their childhoods being stolen day by invisible day. But perhaps more significant were the mental changes. The constant sensory deprivation had altered their perception of reality in fundamental ways. They had learned to navigate and function in complete darkness so effectively that they rarely stumbled or collided anymore. Their hearing had become preternaturally acute, able to detect the slightest sounds, the scratch of a rat in the corner, the drip of water from a particular stone, the approach of footsteps long before the food slot opened. Their sense of touch had refined to the point where they could identify each other instantly by the texture of skin or hair or the particular way someone moved. But they had also begun to forget what sight was like, what colors looked like, what faces looked like. The younger children especially were losing their visual memories, and this loss terrified the older ones, who tried desperately to preserve those memories through constant description and storytelling. The winter of their second year was brutally cold, and the children huddled together in one mass of bodies, sharing warmth like a litter of puppies. The boundaries between individual selves blurring in the darkness and the cold. Grace, who had been 7 when they entered and was now 9, began to lose feeling in her toes, and Ruth worried about frostbite, though she couldn't see to examine them. They wrapped Grace's feet in extra cloth, torn from their deteriorating clothes, and surrounded her with the warmth of other bodies, creating a healing nest in the darkness. This incident prompted the older children to institute new protocols for health monitoring, conducting daily check-ins, where each child had to report any pain, numbness, or unusual sensation, creating a verbal medical chart that they all memorized. Benjamin developed a persistent cough that rattled in his chest and wouldn't go away no matter how much they tried to keep him warm. Isaiah applied the only treatment available, keeping Benjamin hydrated with their limited water and surrounding him with warm bodies, while the other children prayed to whatever God might be listening that Benjamin wouldn't die in the darkness, that none of them would die before seeing light again. The fear of death in the darkness haunted all of them, not just the dying itself, but the horror of corpses in the enclosed space, of not being able to see or properly attend to a fallen friend. "We all getting out of here alive," Samuel would declare regularly, making it both a promise and a command. "All 12 of us. Nobody dies in the dark." At some point around the 2.5-year mark, something shifted in the children's collective consciousness. A transition from desperate hope of imminent rescue to acceptance of their reality and determination to survive, regardless of how long it took. They stopped asking when they would get out and started focusing on how to maintain themselves indefinitely. Moses suggested they create a constitution, a set of laws and principles that would govern their underground society. They debated and refined these rules over many sleep cycles, eventually settling on principles that would have impressed any moral philosopher. Share all resources equally regardless of age or size. Never lie to each other no matter how harsh the truth. Protect the youngest and weakest first. Make decisions by consensus when possible. And maintain hope through collective ritual and storytelling. Clara proposed they create a calendar of celebrations, not based on real dates, since they had no idea what day or month it was, but based on their own counting. Every 30th day would be Freedom Day, where they would describe in detail what they would do when released. Every 60th day would be Family Day, where they would share memories of their mothers, fathers, and siblings. These invented holidays gave structure to the endless time and created moments of collective joy even in their darkness. They sang, they told stories, they shared dreams, and for brief moments they transcended their physical circumstances through the power of ritual and imagination. 3 years into their captivity, on what they had no way of knowing was February 1859, everything changed. The children heard sounds above them that were different from the usual quiet of the plantation. Many voices, shouting, the heavy tread of multiple feet, what sounded like furniture being moved. They pressed against the walls, trying to understand what was happening, hope and fear warring in their chests. Had Blackwell decided to finally kill them? Were creditors seizing the property? Was this rescue or was this something worse? For hours, the commotion continued above, while they waited in tense silence below. Then they heard something they hadn't heard in 3 years. The sound of the heavy wooden barrier being removed from above their door, the scrape of wood on wood, the click of the lock turning. "Get back from the door," Samuel commanded, his voice sharp with authority. "All the young ones to the back corner. Whatever coming through that door, we ready." The door swung open, and for the first time in 3 years, light, even the dim light of an overcast winter day, poured into the cellar. The children screamed, clapping hands over their eyes, the light stabbing into their darkness, adapted eyes like knives, bringing tears and pain and unbelievable beauty all at once. Through the blinding light, they heard voices, shocked voices, voices saying things like, "Lord have mercy," and "How long they been down here?" And they're just children, just babies. The people who had opened the door were federal marshals who had finally succeeded in seizing Blackwell's plantation to settle his debts. And they had found the hidden cellar door while conducting a thorough inventory of the property. What they saw when they opened that door would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 12 children, their clothes in rags, their bodies emaciated, their skin pale from lack of sunlight, their eyes unable to tolerate even dim light, huddled together like frightened animals, but standing in protective formation with the older children in front of the younger ones. The marshals had expected, perhaps, stolen property or hidden valuables. Instead, they found 12 souls who had survived 3 years in absolute darkness through nothing but mutual support, fierce determination, and the kind of resilience that shouldn't be possible in beings so young. The children couldn't walk up the stairs at first. Their legs had weakened from 3 years of limited movement in a cramped space, and the light was too painful to navigate by. They had to be carried up one by one, squinting through hands pressed over their eyes, emerging into a cold February afternoon that must have seemed like paradise despite its chill. Richard Blackwell was arrested immediately, though he would later serve minimal prison time because the law did not recognize his crime as particularly severe. They were, after all, his property to do with as he saw fit. This legal reality enraged the marshals who had found the children, but it reflected the moral bankruptcy of a system that valued property rights over human dignity. The 12 children were taken to a hospital in Lexington, where doctors examined them with a mixture of horror and amazement. All 12 showed severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies that had affected their bone development, dental problems from poor diet, respiratory issues from the damp cellar, and vision problems from 3 years in darkness. But they had survived with no major diseases, no broken bones, no signs of having harmed each other, despite 3 years in close confinement. The doctors were astounded by this, not understanding that the children's survival was precisely because they had taken care of each other, had created a society based on mutual support rather than competition for limited resources. The hospital staff noted something else remarkable. The 12 children refused to be separated, becoming agitated whenever anyone tried to move them to different rooms. They would only sleep when they could hear each other's breathing, only eat when they were all together, only answer questions when they were in a group. 3 years of interdependence had bonded them in ways that outsiders couldn't fully comprehend. They had become a single organism with 12 parts, a family unit that no biological relation could rival. Samuel spoke for the group, his voice rusty from disuse in the upper world, but clear in its message. We stay together, all of us. We ain't being separated again. The hospital administrators, moved by their story, agreed to keep them together during recovery. Over the following months, the children gradually adjusted to light, to space, to the overwhelming sensory input of the normal world. Their eyes slowly regained the ability to tolerate sunlight, though several of them would have permanent vision problems. Their bodies began to recover with proper nutrition, though they would always carry the physical marks of their 3 years in darkness: stunted growth, weakened bones, chronic respiratory issues. But their psychological recovery was more complex. They had nightmares about being trapped in darkness again. They panicked in enclosed spaces. They hoarded food, unable to trust that meals would come regularly. They clung to each other with desperate intensity, terrified of separation. A kind woman named Harriet Mills, who ran a boarding house for free black people in Lexington, offered to take in all 12 children, giving them a home where they could stay together as the family they had become. In her large house with multiple rooms, the children could have had individual beds, individual spaces, but they chose to sleep together in one large room, pushing their beds together to recreate the huddled closeness they had known in the darkness. "Why you all sleep like that when you got the whole house?" Harriet asked gently. Ruth, now 16 and the spokesperson the group had chosen, answered, "In the darkness, all we had was each other. We learned that being together is what kept us alive, what kept us human. We ain't forgetting that lesson just because we can see now." Over the next several years, the 12 Children of Darkness, as they became known in Lexington, stayed together as a family unit, supporting each other through the challenges of recovery and adjustment. Samuel and Moses learned trades, carpentry and blacksmithing, and eventually opened a shop together. Ruth and Clara became teachers, eventually running a small school for black children, both enslaved and free, teaching them not just reading and mathematics, but also resilience, mutual support, and the power of community. Benjamin became a preacher, his beautiful voice finally serving the purpose it was meant for, though his sermons always contained references to finding light in darkness, to hope in hopeless circumstances. Sarah became a healer, applying the knowledge Isaiah had taught her in the darkness and adding to it through apprenticeship with local root workers. The younger children, Rebecca, Elijah, Grace, Job, and Mary, grew up in Harriet's boarding house, with the older children serving as parents, siblings, and teachers, creating a functional family structure that defied conventional definitions. When the Civil War came and emancipation was finally declared, the 12 Children of Darkness, now young adults, were uniquely prepared for freedom in ways that others who had been enslaved were not. They had learned in the most extreme circumstances possible that freedom wasn't just a physical state, but a mental one. That human dignity couldn't be taken away by external circumstances if it was properly guarded internally. And that community and mutual support were more valuable than any individual advantage. 20 years after emerging from the darkness, in 1879, the 12 gathered for what had become their annual reunion, held every February on the anniversary of their liberation. They were now in their late 20s and early 30s, most with families of their own, but they still carried the bond forged in those 3 years of absolute darkness. Samuel, now 34 and a successful business owner, stood to address the group as he did every year. "We were children when they put us in that darkness," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience and reflection. "They thought they were hiding property. What they actually did was create something they could never understand. They created a family stronger than blood, a bond deeper than anything they could break, and a group of people who learned the most important lesson of survival. We are stronger together than any of us could ever be alone." Ruth added, "In that darkness we could have turned on each other. We could have fought over the little food they gave us. We could have let the youngest and weakest die to preserve the strongest. But we didn't. We chose a different way. We chose to share, to care, to protect each other. That choice is what saved us." Clara spoke next. "They took 3 years of our childhood. They took our sight, our health, our normal development. But they couldn't take our humanity. They couldn't make us into the animals they said we were. We proved, even as children, that we were fully human, capable of love and sacrifice and creating beauty even in hell. The 12 children of darkness lived long lives, most into their 60s and 70s, which was remarkable given the trauma their bodies had endured. Their story spread through the black community as a testament to survival and resistance, though the white community largely forgot them or dismissed their ordeal as an unfortunate incident in an otherwise normal system. The children never forgot each other. Even when separated by distance, they maintained correspondence, visited when possible, and ensured that their children knew each other and understood the story of those 3 years in darkness. When Job, the youngest of the 12, died in 1921 at the age of 71, the remaining 11 attended his funeral, elderly now but still recognizable to each other by the particular way they moved, the specific timbre of their voices, the indefinable sense of kinship that transcended ordinary friendship. At that funeral, Mary, the last of the younger children and now an old woman of 71 herself, spoke the truth that they had all understood since emerging from that cellar. People ask us how we survived. They want to know the secret like it's some trick or technique, but there ain't no secret. We survived because we loved each other, because we chose every single day in that darkness to be human to each other. That's the only secret there ever was. Their story became part of the oral tradition passed down through generations, a story about the worst of what slavery could do and the best of what human beings could be in response. A story that illustrated that even in absolute darkness, the human spirit could find light within itself. In remembering the 12 children of darkness, we remember that childhood under slavery was not childhood as we understand it, but a time of stolen innocence and forced maturity, yet also a time when young souls demonstrated capacity for love, leadership, and resilience that many adults could not match. We remember that these 12 children created in their darkness a society more just and compassionate than the one that imprisoned them, that they shared when they could have hoarded, that they protected the weak when they could have exploited them, that they maintained hope when despair would have been entirely justified. We remember that freedom, for those who survived slavery, was never a simple transition from bondage to liberty, but a complex journey of healing, adjustment, and learning to trust a world that had proven itself untrustworthy. We remember that the bonds formed in struggle often prove stronger and more lasting than any formed in comfort, that community created by necessity can become family by choice, and that the human capacity for adaptation, for finding meaning even in meaningless suffering, for creating light in darkness, is both tragic proof of what we can endure and inspiring evidence of what we can become. The story of the 12 children of darkness teaches us that dignity is not granted by circumstances, but claimed through choice, that humanity is not defined by how we are treated, but by how we treat each other, and that even 3 years of absolute darkness cannot extinguish the light that burns within the human soul when it is properly tended by love, hope, and mutual care. May we honor their memory by choosing, as they did, to be lights for each other in whatever darkness we face, to build communities of care rather than competition, and to never forget that the most vulnerable among us often demonstrate the greatest strength, the deepest wisdom, and the most profound understanding of what it truly means to be human.